G'day, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac. Navigation between view controllers in a tab bar controller is handled automatically by the tab bar controller, but often these view controllers share a common data model. Let's look at a clean way to share data between views in a tab bar controller. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is open Xcode and create a new project. It'll be a single view app and we're going to call it tab bar segue. We'll save that on the desktop. I'll delete the standard view controller and we'll create our standard folders of models and view controllers. We'll get rid of the launch screen. In our main storyboard, we'll delete the default view controller, and what we're going to do is just create a standard tab view controller, or tab bar controller. I keep calling them tab view controllers. So we've got our standard tab bar controller, and it's got two view controllers, and we're going to create two view controllers or custom view controllers called first view controller and second view controller. And then in our main storyboard, we'll so those first two controllers. Now I want to put a label on the first controller, and we will center that and we will call it current value. We'll give it some constraints and center it horizontally and center it vertically. And then on the second controller, I also want to label, and I'll give that some constraints. And center that horizontally and vertically. And center the text. And also want to put a button. And I want the button to say add. And I'll give that some constraints. So I will make it underneath that vertical. I will make it horizontal. And then we will just give it the standard width and height. And that's not wide enough. We can update that. I'll just delete that one. That's better. Okay, and so now we've placed all of the items that we're looking for. Might just move that down a tad. And update the constant constraint so it keeps that value. So now that we've got the controls on the screen, we need to set up some outlets for those. So on item 1, we need the first view controller, and then we just create create the first outlet. So we'll just put that as current value label. And then on the second view controller, we need the outlet for the label, which we'll just say is also called current value label. And we're not going to change the value of add, but we do want to be able to click on the button. So we'll create an action and we'll just call it add button. It's of type UI button. So that is our interface, and if we just run that just to see what happens. Failed to instantiate default controller. So as is always the way we forgot to place is initial view controller for the tab bar. Okay, so we're underway. So we haven't placed any icons or renamed anything here, but the current value is the default value, and here with the second one, we got value in this add button, which when we click on does nothing, but everything's displaying the way we expect. So with tab bars, okay, so there's no clock for me to give you a demonstration. So you've got your phone and you see across the bottom you've got these tabs, and the thing is that there's really no data between the world clock and the alarm clock or bedtime or stopwatch. Like, all these things are time related, but you don't have a generic model or data set that is going to be shared between each of these tabs. So in this case, what you can do is you can just simply add variables to the class of the view controller, and it can manipulate those while that window is open. But if you've got a case where, and that's the second possibility, where the tabs represent various different features of the same data set. For instance, if it was an address book, the first tab could be, you know, your name and phone number and email address, and then the second tab might be your physical address and postal address, and the third tab could be you know, your likes and dislikes, or I don't know, other functions. But basically all of that data model is going to be the one model shared across multiple view controllers. So how can we do that? And there's actually, well, not hundreds of ways, but there's several different ways that it can be done. And depending on how much of a encapsulation Nazi you are depends on which is the way that you would prefer to do. So you could set up a singleton, and I've done in my iOS Essentials group, I've done singletons, but one way, and probably a preferred way, is to encapsulate the data within the tab view controller. That is, by making a custom tab view controller, and rather than customizing the tabs, we're going to supply the data model as part of a new custom class. So under view controls, we'll just create a new file, which is still going to be a CocoaTouch class, and it's going to be a UI tab controller. To the way down at the bottom, tab bar controller, I should say, UI tab bar controller, and we're just going to call it my, in fact we're going to call it base tab bar controller. We're actually going to put it under models, and what our base tab bar controller does, it's a subclass of a UI tab bar controller, and we don't need any of this. But what we do need is some data. So the data can be a structure, or it can be a set of properties, and for us we just want to increment a value. So we're going to have a variable that we're going to call the value. It's going to be an integer, and by default it's going to be 0. And back in our main storyboard, what we want to do here is for our tab bar controller, instead of the UI tab bar controller, we wish to use our base tab bar controller, and that'll mean that the tab bar will know about this property, the value, and our okay, so we've got our data, which we know it's going to be 0. So when we load a tab bar, you may recall there's an array. So both of the first view controller and the second view controller, they're part of this array that's owned by the tab bar controller, and they're loaded once, and they're loaded when the tab bar controller is instantiated. So what we want to do here is we want to set the current value label equal to this value. What we do is we need to get a copy of the tab bar, and there's a property of a view controller, which is the tab bar controller that it belongs to, and we want to cast that as a base tab bar controller, and then we know that's going to succeed because we know that the tab bar is a base tab bar controller, so we can force that. And then what we need to do is we need to set the current value label text equal to, and then we will just cast the value of tab bar dot the value, which is our integer, and then when we run this, so now we've got 0 set. So instead of saying current value, it says 0. So we've initialized the text in the first controller, and when we go to the second controller, it says value. So what we really need to do is, in the second case, we need to do the exact same thing. Now, what we want to do with this add button is every time we click the button, we just want to increment the value. So it's going to start 0, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, etc. So that's a pretty straightforward thing to do. We get the value out of the text field. We'll need to force unwrap that, and because this, and we want to convert this to an integer, so we'll cast it. Now this int could return nil if this text here is some sort of alpha character. It can't be the case for us, but the compiler doesn't know that, so we just need to do an if statement, and then all we want to do is we want to increment the value that we receive by 1 and cast it back to a string. Value plus 1, and if we run that. Okay, so what we've got is our add buttons working, and when we flick between these two values, there's no updating of the information, which is what we want to do. We want to be able to share the data, and the way to do that is within the view controller there are two functions. Let me get rid of this one. In fact, there are 4 functions. I'll just bring those up and I'll show you. Right. Right, there we go. So there's 4 functions here. View will appear, view did appear, view will disappear, view did disappear. So it's got a little description on when they're called. Called when the view is about to be made visible, and default does nothing. called when the view has been fully transitioned onto the screen. So we want to use this view will appear, and we also want to use the view will disappear, called when the view is dismissed, covered or otherwise hidden. View did disappear is called after it's been dismissed. So what we want to do is create these in the second view controller. View will appear and view will disappear. And when the view will appear is called, this is going to be called every time the window is brought to the front, and this is going to be called every time the window is pushed or just before it's pushed to the back. So every time we click between these two things, we're getting these messages saying this one's going to appear and this one's going to disappear. So, and this is different to view did load, because view did load is only called once, because the tab bar controller keeps all of these view controllers in memory all of the time while the tab bar is the review controller. So view will appear. What we want to do is we actually want to, for the sake of argument here, is we want to reset this value to 0 every time we bring this to the front. Well, it's actually quite a simple thing to do. We just say set the current value of the text to be 0, and on the view will disappear. What we want to do is we want to set the value of the value, which was part of our tab view, the value here. We want to set that to be whatever's in the text. So again, we need to get this tab bar controller, and then we want to set tab bar dot the value equal to the, why did I do it like that, the integer of current value dot text. And we will need to give that a forced outcome there. And if we go back to the first view controller, we want those exact same two view, or we want view will appear. And in view will appear here, what we want to do is we want to do what we did here on view did load. We want to get the current value and set it into the into this label. So essentially, when we run this now, what should happen is when we go to item 2, we can add numbers to this, but every time we come here, it's going to start with 0. And every time we go back to 1, this number is going to reflect the last number on the tab view controller. So just run that now. So it starts off as 0 because that's what's happening in view did load. When we go to item 2, we can add some numbers. So we've got 3. So when we go back to item 1, it should show us the number 3, and it does not. Why is that? Okay, so the reason why it's not updating in this case is because view will appear is occurring prior to the screen being visible, and so there's no update for the screen because you don't update non-visible screens. So we need to set this to view did appear, and then that way when we run it, the update will occur when things are on screen and it'll happen instantaneously. So 2, and there you go, there's our 2, and when we go back we've got a 0. So that's showing you how to keep data pseudo-globally between multiple views, or at least restricted to within all of the views within this tab bar controller. I hope that is of use. So that's how you can share data between views in a tab bar controller. It's not the only way, but it is a very clean way of doing it. The view did load and view will load are subtly different. Say you need to get data from across a network, then you probably want to display an activity control on screen, so you need to be making your request in the view did load call once the view is displayed. That allows the activity control to be seen and active. If you were to make a call in view will load, then if it's a synchronous call, your app would freeze and nothing would happen until the data arrived, and then the view would be displayed. The same, of course, is true for the view did disappear and the view will disappear. Any validity checking that you need to do should be done in view will disappear prior to the view disappearing, so that you can display any errors and requests and prevent the disappearance from happening if necessary. If you have any questions about the tutorial, then please leave a comment below or hit me up on Twitter @SwiftAlmanac. Please subscribe to the channel, it's free, and check out our website at www.swiftalmanac.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.